Hello, and thank you for joining the final live chat in the 2019 series about the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowships. My name is Jessica Soul, and I'm the Recruitment Director with the S&T Policy Fellowships. I will be your moderator for today's chat. The 2019 live chat series is an opportunity for you to ask fellows your questions. Here with me today are fellows Allison Kennedy, Amanda Korkos, and Vince Tajasaputra. The 2019 live chat series features one chat each month of the application season, and today is our final chat before the application closes on November 1st. Because of this, today's topic is Ask a Fellow Anything. A recording of this chat and all of our live chats in the series can be found on the fellowship website. We'll share that link at the end of today's chat. These recordings are a great resource no matter where you are in your application process. So as I said before, the application is now open and will close Friday, November 1st at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time. So we're curious, would like to get to know who's joining us today. Do you plan to apply? Thanks for applying to this poll that you see on the screen. All right, everybody. Ooh, look at who's joining us today. We are so thrilled to see you here. We have a lot of folks who are applying this year, a few people who are not quite there yet, but maybe applying in a future year. And no matter where you are in the application process or in your science policy journey, we really hope that you get your questions answered and you learn more information about STPF today. So as a really quick reminder, you can submit questions via chat at any time by clicking the question box in your menu and typing in your questions there. And in your message, you can indicate which panelist or which people your question is directed to. And we'll try to answer as many questions as possible, again, since this is our last chat in the series before the app closes. We may try to answer some technical questions in the chat box, especially if there are other resources that already exist to support you. Okay, now with that, it is time to properly introduce the fellows who are going to be joining us today. So first we have Dr. Allison Kennedy. She has recently completed 2 years as an executive branch fellow at the National Science Foundation in the Division of Computers and Network Systems. In this role, she built relationships and stakeholders across sectors. So this included the federal government, K-12 education, nonprofit sector, and academia, all of this to make computer science education inclusive for all students. Also joining Allison is Dr. Amanda Korkos. She's currently in her 2nd year as an executive branch fellow with the State Department in the Office of Intellectual Property Enforcement. Her portfolio covers 50 countries, including EU and non-EU Europe. And we are also joined by Dr. Vince Tajasaputra. He's in his 1st year as an executive branch fellow at the National Science Foundation in the Office of Legislative and Public Affairs. So prior to beginning his fellowship, he completed a postdoctoral fellowship in pulmonary physiology at the UC San Diego School of Medicine. Thank you all for joining us today. So as I mentioned, the theme for today's chat is Ask a Fellow Anything. And the audience is submitting questions in advance and right now in the text box, but I'll kick us off and take the liberty of asking the first question, which is, knowing what you know now, what do you wish somebody had told you before you applied to STPF? And Vince, as the 1st year fellow who maybe is closest to his application, would you be willing to kick us off? And I'm not able to hear you, so you might be muted.
All right, I'm unmuted.
Thank you.
So a big thing is you don't have to have any policy experience to apply, definitely not any policy experience to get in. One thing that I really enjoy about the fellowship community is that non-fellows and fellows talk to each other freely. So one thing that I did was I looked on LinkedIn and I just literally typed in AAAS fellows, and then anybody who I had a connection with or not at all, I just sent messages to talk to them about their experience specifically applying to and putting together my application. So that was a big thing to actually talk to another human who just did it or not so far removed from the process to get firsthand experience from that.
I think that's really great advice. And Amanda, are you willing to share next?
Yeah, sure. So the thing that I really noted in having started this fellowship is that it's so unique. So not just in terms of it being a science policy fellowship and with the federal government, but that there's so many different opportunities. So each fellow has a unique experience. You're in a different office working on different projects, but there's also even different opportunities that you might not have thought of. So I'm actually in an office I didn't know existed when I initially applied to the fellowship. So the fact that it can, you may not have any policy experience at this point, but it's something you're interested and want to learn about. And this is a great opportunity to do that, since there's things you might not have even thought about before.
Thanks, Amanda. And Allison?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add to both of what Vince and Amanda said. I think, I mean, the thing I didn't appreciate is just how many fellows there are, past and current. And I mean, you can pretty much throw a stone and hit a fellow anywhere that you are. And what I also didn't appreciate is how willing fellows are to talk with applicants and really encourage people to join and help throughout the process. So when I applied, I was connected through a friend of a friend to a current fellow who walked me through each step of the application process, and her insights were immensely helpful. And you'd be surprised how many people are willing to do that because people just value their fellowship experience and they want to share that with others.
Thank you all. I really appreciate the numerous and unique things that you've discovered about STPF as you're going through your fellowship, the sheer diversity and number of perspectives and that willingness to kind of be part of this family, this community, and support one another. I can only reinforce that and encourage everybody who's listening. You now know 3 fellows, and we are happy to connect you with others if you have questions as you go through your application. So I would love to hear from you all. Maybe Amanda, could you kick us off and share maybe what motivated you to step into the science policy sphere?
Sure. It's something I've been interested in for a while, but I didn't have pretty much any experience. During my postdoc, I was part of a group called the Science Policy Outreach Task Force, and we took a trip. I was in Illinois at the time, and we took a trip down to the state government in Champaign, and Springfield, because I always confuse it. And it was just a really eye-opening experience, just how the different representatives, what their scientific background is or isn't, where they get their information from. And so I really enjoyed everything I've been doing working in a lab for the previous 11 or 12 years, but I wanted to have a bigger impact and use my scientific background in a way that I thought could have a big impact. And I figured this would be a terrific opportunity to learn how to do that by working with other experienced people.
Thanks. And Vince, could you share next? Because I know you had kind of a unique background before coming to the fellowship.
Yeah, so I came to the fellowship actually out of a research finding. In graduate school, I studied patients with COPD, or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and it's a disease that comes from a long time smoking. And so I'm an exercise physiologist, and some of the stuff that I found was that patients with mild COPD, they have 80% or better lung function. They have less blood in their lungs during exercise compared to somebody at the same age, at the same height, the same sex, at the same level of exercise. And so my previous work showed that we might be able to exercise train people. Now, you've heard of cardiac rehab. Well, there is pulmonary rehab, but currently Medicare only pays for moderate and severe COPD patients to get a pulmonary rehab with the rationale that their mild COPD are not sick enough. So I thought, hey, here are data that shows that they don't have to be that sick to possibly benefit from this, and nobody's listening. So that's what sort of drove me to apply to the fellowship. And even though I'm not working on that now, I'm always looking at ways I can encourage other people to say, hey, what are the policy implications of your work that can have an effect on millions of Americans?
Thank you, Vince. And Allison, what brought you to the NSF after your time, doing similar work in other sectors beforehand?
Yeah, so I did not want to be in academia anymore after my postdoc. I was burnt out from grad school and tired of, kind of being a broke grad student and wanted to just switch sectors. I mean, honestly, that's what drew me to the fellowship. I knew also at the same time I was really interested in education policy. I'd done a lot of outreach, I'd done a lot of summer camps and teaching. And so, when I interviewed at NSF in the computer science division, that was the work they were doing. They were doing a lot of work in education research, a lot of work in equity and inclusion, and these were all things that I cared about very deeply. And so even though computer science was way out of my scientific wheelhouse, the other parts of it were really, really close to me. And so it just made sense for me. It seemed like a good fit, and it was, and I'm still here after my fellowship. So it was life-changing, really.
Thank you all. And I'm guessing that a lot of the people who are listening right now are kind of nodding along to some of the things that you've shared. This desire, the things that you care about, a desire to see a public impact, especially based on your research findings. Perhaps they're feeling burnt out from grad school or looking for something unique. And you all have very different backgrounds, and yet you found your way to this experience. And to those who are kind of on the precipice, applying now, if you could look back at your application when you were applying, can you think of, or do you know why, how you made your application stand out? Vince, are you willing to kick us off here?
Yeah, so from somebody who had zero policy experience, and I mean no lines at all on my CV that could speak to science policy, I had the impression from other fellows that I've spoken to is that they're looking for people who understand how your skills that you gained in your PhD or in your master's program could transfer to this. We spend a lot of time looking at a very small slice of a disease or a cell or some physiological process. That's just in my field. But if you're able to connect the dots and say, so what, to somebody who's a taxpayer or somebody who might be voting on a bill to ban something or to fund something, that was the biggest thing to me, is to write in a way that you understand that scientists, their role is not limited only to the bench or only to the classroom, that in fact, if policymakers are making decisions that affect scientists should be in the room. And that's what I think. I tried to convey that sort of passion in my application, and then along with that, I think that science communication is not standardized. That training is not standardized in graduate school, and so we've sort of come to this point where there's a bit of growing anti-intellectualism across the U.S., both politically and not politically, and so it's our job. I mean, I spent 15 years in science before I came to this policy fellowship, and I only did 2 years of postdoc, and so we have to have some ability and some responsibility to take to Facebook, or not let misinformation spread as quickly, because we are the experts, and we should be able to really articulate that comfortably, and I think that's part of our big role.
And I wonder if you could elaborate, if you remember how you tackled your extracurriculars section and some of these other sections of the application, knowing that maybe you didn't have the science policy background, but with these other transferable skills and all this experience.
Yeah, so science was sort of a side project. I did a lot of things outside of science, I started, I was a college athlete. I was in the track and field team, and that led to me being an exercise physiologist. And then in my other life, I'm an opera singer, and that sort of led me into doing lung things. And so while along the way, all of my supervisors said, "You're really distracted. You need to be focusing on your work." And I said, "Yeah, okay." But it turns out in the end, this is what made me well, I got into the fellowship, so it made me a standout applicant to a way that I understand that these things aren't distractions. Rather, they made me understand the world a little bit better, and bringing back the real world experience into science made me not just a better scientist, a better person, but a better citizen of the U.S. And so don't be afraid to do the things that make you happy, because otherwise, what's the point? And brag about them. This is what make you you.
Thank you for sharing all of that perspective, Vince. And Allison, I saw you nodding along. Is there anything you would like to add or share from your perspective when you were applying?
I mean, I think the fellowship draws people that do have broader interests outside of just sort of research or lab work or bench work. So, I mean, a lot of what Vince was saying was just resonating with me, because I did so many things outside of the lab. I did so much outreach and teaching, you know, beyond what a normal grad student would do. I was lucky to have a supportive PI, but she also kind of recognized that those were the things that were important to me, and so allowed me to find that balance. But I think that because I did all of those things, it created this cohesive narrative in my application that, you know, I was constantly engaged in a number of different things as it sort of, you know, adjacent to my research and science in grad school, but really I was getting out of the lab, I was communicating science to a lot of different audiences, and that I was passionate about these things. So I think, you know, all of those things are really stand out in the application, and it doesn't hurt that the program itself sort of draws people in who may have those interests already.
Thank you. And I know that a lot of people who are, you know, some people are listening in who aren't maybe applying this year, but plan to apply in a future year, maybe next year, in a few years when they've completed their degree. And so Amanda, I wonder if you can answer this question too, thinking about how you prepared for your application, but maybe, you know, was there anything you did several years out preparing for your application, you know, before you actually applied?
Yeah, so I'm an inorganic chemist by training, and one thing I actually learned about the fellowship when I was still in grad school, and I didn't apply until at the end of my postdoc. And so part of what I did is I chose to switch fields of chemistry, so from inorganic chemistry to organic materials, partly just for my own interest, but I found it much easier to communicate science when there was a tangible result that the general public could understand. So I went from studying catalytic reactive intermediates, which is a mouthful, to studying new materials to purify water. And I think that, as Vince and Allison mentioned, communication is key. So if you just have an idea in the back of your head why you're doing what you're doing, why it's important, what the bigger effects of it can be, just simple statements where you don't have to go into too much detail can be really helpful getting that information across. The other thing I would suggest for the application, as Vince and Allison mentioned, you know, just besides talking about all the terrific things and you have to be your own cheerleader, be your authentic self. You shouldn't write about what you think a panel would want to hear. It needs to be who you are, what you want to accomplish. And to recognize too that this is a great learning opportunity. You're not going to come into this fellowship and just be able to change everything that's going on here, but it's a terrific environment to learn. And so, you know, having kind of set yourself up thinking about your career long term, if there's anything extracurricular wise or through your current research that could enable you to kind of move towards policy if that's where you want to go, to learn how to communicate in a very direct manner, but also just be your authentic self.
Thank you, Amanda. I really appreciate what everybody has shared. You know, I think there is a lot of great things that somebody can do right now to think about who they are, what they're bringing to the fellowship, what they're hoping to learn, and that they can start to tap into these and to explore, even if they're several years out from applying. Allison, I appreciated the phrase you used, like adjacent to your research, that you were doing work that, you know, was exploratory and was exploring these other parts of who you are as a person, and that it expands your perspective and it makes you unique. Because nobody who's listening in when they apply is going to have an application that looks like Amanda's or Vince's or Allison's, and we see that as a really a great thing. That's an asset to the program. So we have another question from our audience, and let's see. So we have a question about kind of how specific or broad to be in their application and in their materials. So thinking of the applicant statement, you know, how did you approach it, and do you think that it served you well in terms of being very specific and narrow and articulating your interests and goals, or being a bit broader in your application? Amanda, do you remember how you approached your essay? Could you kick us off?
Sure. So I was a little bit specific. I think I mentioned 2 or 3 areas where I had a general interest, and why I thought those topics were important. But I wasn't so specific as to kind of caveat myself into any one area. So for example, I did not mention any of the departments that I might want to eventually work in, just because that might kind of like keep you in an area that doesn't open as many opportunities. So I think it's kind of threading the line there. So you need to be specific in what you're interested in, but not so general that you say you're interested in everything, right? Like you do need to thread the line a little bit there.
Allison, are you willing to share next from your perspective, how you handled your application and how you think it served you?
Yeah, I mean, I think Amanda's right on. I mean, you want to find that balance between specifying areas that you're interested in, but not, you know, agencies or very specific policies. Because I think one thing that's really important to know about this fellowship is it's whatever you think it is not that. Like you're gonna get there, and it's important to have an open mind, especially in the interview process, and you know, throughout the entire fellowship. Really, it's important to be open-minded. I am a biologist, had no intention of being anywhere close to computer science. I was surprised when I interviewed here, but then was also surprised that it seemed like the perfect fit for me. So it's kind of something you should keep in mind from the very beginning when you're writing your application. Is it's important to hone in on those issues that you're interested in, policy issues broadly, and then kind of leave the rest pretty open. That's what I would say.
And Vince, anything you would like to add?
I'm going to kind of disagree a little bit. So if there is a specific policy thing that makes you, that is lit you on fire, you should definitely write about it, I think. I mean, and there's a lot to choose from today, especially. And so to me, that was like my particular brand, like my own branding. I was particularly interested in the science communication aspect, and everybody in the fellowship is a good communicator, but I honed in on why aren't we being taught science communication in graduate school as a standardized curriculum. So as so far as to, like, you don't have to know exactly what you want to work on, but if there's something that really gets you going, you should absolutely talk about it. That being said, don't pigeonhole yourself by saying, I only want to work for the State Department, or I only want to work for NIH, because these applications do get circulated to NIH and State Department, and so that's not something that's probably going to be favorable. But you do want to show that you're flexible enough to be, you know, a biologist who ended up in computer network systems, or physiologist in legislative and public affairs. So I'd say, you know, just to reiterate, like, if there's something specific that really that you're passionate about, you should talk about it.
Allison or Amanda, do you have any other thoughts that Vince has inspired?
No, I mean, I think we're all kind of saying the same thing. but I mean, yeah, so when I think about my application, I mean, I was really passionate about equity and STEM. So I wrote from that lens. But I don't think I, narrowed it down too much into like, this is how I'm going to address that issue, something like that, so that I wouldn't pigeonhole myself in that way.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's part of the threading the needle part, to be specific in what you want, but not pigeonhole yourself.
I think that, yeah, you all are kind of saying the same thing, and I do think you've said all the keywords around it. It's being authentic and knowing yourself and bringing that to your application while also knowing your audience and not pigeonholing yourself if you are open to other opportunities, other experiences that you may not know existed, which I think happened with you, Allison, with an office that you didn't know existed. But I'm sure that bringing yourself, bringing your interest and how you articulated yourself, helped you stand out in your application. And I wonder, do you all remember articulating what you hope to learn from the fellowship? Vince, I see you nodding. Are you willing to share what you included in your application?
Yeah, so I want to go back to saying that I had zero experience in science policy, but I knew like everybody comes to the fellowship with starry eyes, thinking they're gonna change the world, and you might, and we probably will, but I knew that because I had no background in it, that's what I wanted to learn. I wanted to know what is the nuance of politics or science in policy or vice versa. I think we all come in pretty naive thinking, I think if we just shout the facts loud enough or throw data in the faces of congressmen, they'll just change they'll change legislation. But really, what I want to know is like, what is the process? Like, what is the language? What are the levers to pull? When to push or when to sit down? I mean, I think orientation was a great experience for me because we learned a little bit like, okay, like, yeah, well, you've got a PhD and you're pretty smart, and you're probably right about a lot of these your scientific opinion backed by data, but at the policy level, like the science is only a sliver, and it depends on who's paying for it or how many jobs are going to be cut, or precedent or cultural relevance. Like these are all things that I came to learn in the fellowship. Like I did the science, and I know how to answer a research question or design a study, but like, how do I convince somebody who's not a scientist, who has a lot of power to change things?
Thank you for sharing that, Vince. And Amanda and Allison, do you remember what you shared around kind of what you were hoping to learn and take away from the fellowship? Maybe Allison, you go. And I wonder, since you've had 2 years being a fellow, do you feel like you met your learning goals from your application?
Oh, yeah, yes and no. I mean, I think we all go into this because we want to have some sort of bigger impact than we were having, at the bench, at least those of us coming from academia. And so in my mind, when I applied, I thought, well, I'm just clearly going to change education in this country, and it's going to be great. And I'd like to think that I've worked toward that, but as Vince kind of alluded to, there's a lot of different people in this space with a lot of different interests. And even when you know how to do something, that does not mean that that's how it's going to be done, because there's so many other factors involved. That being said, I think my experience at NSF it's a little bit different because I'm surrounded by scientists. So, the question about the science isn't really the challenging part. It's implementing these initiatives at a national scale so that they're effective and measured and impactful. And so that's something that, we continue to work on here, and I think is a really, really interesting part about being in the government, is this sort of bird's eye view of things.
How about you, Amanda?
So, I mean, I came into it wanting to learn how policy works, learn how the federal government works. So to that end, one of the things I've tried to take advantage of is just by being a fellow, my office has been pretty open to my, as long as I get the work done for the office, but I can do other things too. So I've gone up to hear Supreme Court hearings. I've gone to hear different committees from the House and the Senate. So part of it for me in applying, and what I tried to get through in my application, was that I care about science policy, but I just also want to understand how policy works. Because as a scientist, I can, take my experiences and either do science for policy or policy for science, since those are two different things. But it was still very much a learning experience in a lot of ways. So I'm actually in an office, I'm in the Economic Bureau here at the State Department, so there aren't any scientists. And I cover Europe for our office in the Office of Intellectual Property Enforcement, but I also now get to learn all about new and emerging technologies too. So in a lot of ways, I'm also learning other types of science. So it was more that I was applying because I wanted to kind of just like learn a lot of new things that I hadn't been exposed to before.
Thank you, Amanda. And I really appreciate that you're talking about learning in your placement and then also learning that you're doing outside of your placement, outside of your office. Vince, you mentioned orientation and all you learned there through the formal professional development that's offered by the S&T Policy Fellowships program. I wonder if there's anything else that comes to mind that you kind of learned outside of that fellowship placement from your peers or through the monthly PD. Was there anything that stood out for any of you?
So the first thing I would say is just become comfortable with networking. It's also something not taught in grad school, but knowing how to approach people, how to have a conversation, just to ask someone for coffee. It doesn't need to be a high pressure thing. And because you are a fellow, and as Allison mentioned, it's such an extensive network here, pretty much anyone is willing to sit down and chat with you. Everyone loves to talk about themselves, right? But also you can learn from a lot of people in high places, because if you say I'm a AAAS fellow as compared to, I work in this office so and somewhere, because you have that network built in, you can actually open a lot of doors that you wouldn't have been able to otherwise. So networking for sure.
Allison or Vince, anything else to add from your perspective, things you maybe learned outside of your 9 to 5?
I think Amanda kind of touched at this, but the informational interview was something I had never heard of before I came to DC. But it's a way of networking if you're not comfortable in like big groups, like at those receptions where you have to kind of talk to lots of different people in a fast moving environment. I, for one, hate that. So the informational interview is like a really great way to talk to somebody one-on-one. Meet for coffee, and you'd be surprised, inside the fellowship or not, people are really willing to talk to you about the work that they do. DC is a networking city, so no matter how you do it, people want to make connections and see, where collaboration and partnership could arise down the line. So you can kind of leverage your fellowship to talk to people in that way, just to get a sense of, what's happening in this space.
So along the lines of networking, so I'm an extrovert, like self-admittedly, and many people can attest to that, but that doesn't mean that introverts do not do well in this program or cannot get in. I think that's a really important
I'm an introvert.
Yeah, and so networking doesn't mean like grabbing a mic and like shouting what you're doing. And rather, it's an internal energy that you bring to a networking event. And yeah, like even for extroverts, it is exhausting. Like, I mean, this is my 4th weekend, and like on weekends I don't do anything because I need to recharge. Like I do a lot of my networking during the week. And so a lot of it is really connecting with the energy of other people and sort of knowing that like if you're an introvert, it doesn't mean that you can't network. It's just a different style.
That's a really nice point, Vince. And I want to even think about this, we're talking about if you become a fellow, taking advantage of the opportunities to network. But I'm thinking now for the people who are on the line, with all this wonderful technology we have, like this live chat, you can connect over email, over phone, you can FaceTime or Skype with somebody. And Vince, you mentioned that you had gone to your LinkedIn network and found fellows. Do you maybe have any tips for somebody who's thinking of doing that? Because like on LinkedIn right now, finding fellows, how they should make that introduction and what they should look for or ask if they wanted to do an informational interview about STPF?
Yeah, so be specific. So I had no idea where I wanted to end up, but looking through AAAS fellows at Department of State, at DoD, at the White House, like take a look at what their background is. And say, Now, for me, the easiest one was like, I looked for people who went to UC San Diego, where I went to. And so I said, hey, I also went to UCSD. I saw you were in the fellowship. Can you give me some tips on my application? And then once I got past the application stage, I contacted other fellows and said, hey, can you help me? How was your interview like? Or what was interview week like? So over time, over the last year, I've kept up with all these people, and meeting them in person is a really great thing. But everybody's always networking, so don't feel bad. You're not asking them for money. You're not asking them for a job. You're just saying, hey, can you share your experience with me? And chances are they'll say yeah, because they did to me. And if you add me on LinkedIn, I'll do that for you too, for sure.
That's a really nice perspective, and the fellowship is for a year or two, and our fellows are, the Alumni Network is over 3,400 people out in the world doing really incredible things. And so maybe in that initial exchange you are seeking guidance, but in 10 years when you have that colleague who's in your network, it's going to be a reciprocal relationship. And so starting to build that now is a great foundation. I wonder, so everybody who's on right now, Allison, Amanda, and Vince, you're all in the executive branch in different agencies for your fellowships. But we also have fellowship placements in the legislative branch and judicial branch. And I wonder, did any of you apply to 2 program areas rather than 1? And if you did, so I see Amanda and Vince nodding that they applied to others, do you remember how much you tailored your applications to the other branch?
I mean, the application does need to be different because they're serving 2 different purposes. So Congress is a very different beast than the executive branch. And so I used some information that was similar in my application. You've done certain so much research. You kind of have to mention that in both of them. But a lot of it of what your goals are, why you're applying, that there are you should be able to articulate, I guess, the differences. And if you can't come up with a difference, then just apply to the one that you are really most excited about. But if you are excited about both opportunities, 2 of the 3 opportunities, definitely take a little bit of time to think about why you want to apply to each of those. And then, again, be your authentic self in the application.
And Amanda, I wonder, do you remember if you had different letters of reference for the different branches when you applied?
I actually used the same letters of reference, just because it's a little bit hard to get anyone to agree to write letters of recommendation, especially since a lot of the grants are all due November 1st for not just this fellowship, but within the federal government. So I only asked for the same people, but in some ways, if you have multiple people that could write for you, who have the time and opportunity and can really tailor that letter to be specific to the 2 different fellowships you apply for, that could be really helpful.
And Vince, what was your experience like applying to the 2 different branches or 2 of them?
I applied to the legislative branch also, mainly because I thought it would double my chances of getting into the fellowship. But no, I did tailor it a bit because you do have different motivations for applying to the executive branch or the legislative branch. I took a more portfolio-centered approach to the legislative branch one. I looked at different fellows who had served, on space science and tech committees, looked at stuff that they wanted to do. So for that, I would say you can be specific on policy things that you want to work on, but don't write that you want to work for a certain senator because they may not be in office by the time your placement comes. And the other thing is there are only 2 placements AAAS hosts for the legislative branch. So make sure that you apply. If you want to apply to the legislative branch, apply to the partner societies, even if you have no relation to what that society is. They probably prefer to host somebody who is in their society, but it's a pretty wide berth. So
Well, that's why I think you can also tailor it to those ones as well, because the questions that the societies ask is slightly different than what AAAS asks. But then you can also better tune like why you would be a good candidate for that particular society.
Yeah, and just to jump in, we can share in the chat box a link to our website and to all of our partner societies, because we work with more than 30 partner societies. So that's organizations like American Geophysical Union or American Chemical Society or American Statistical Association that also sponsor, as Vince is saying, their own congressional fellows. And so we really encourage you to apply through AAAS, and you can pick 2 branches through us, and then also you're welcome to apply through a partner society. And they have different eligibility and requirements and deadlines, so you'll want to explore that link if this is something that's piquing your interest. And then I wonder if you all are willing to share, thinking about your letters of reference. Maybe Amanda, if you could kick us off, thinking about how did you pick the referrers, and also what did you ask them to cover about you in their letters?
Oh boy. So I asked my PhD advisor and my postdoc advisor. But there was also a professor that I had a really good relationship with. He was on my PhD committee since my first year of graduate school. I actually almost joined his group. And he's actually the person who also told me about this fellowship, because he had a student who did it a number of years ago on the congressional side, who's still actually here working up on the Hill. And so I think I just looked for people, you know, who I had a good relationship with, who could talk about the impact, the hard work that I've done, and my general interest in moving in different directions. I did not actually see what they wrote, obviously, so different professors have a different way of writing. Some ask that you write the letter and they sign their name. In this case, I was just very straightforward in saying, you know, what I was hoping to accomplish, since this is a slightly different letter than many of the professors are used to writing. So I actually don't know what was the final version of that, but that's kind of how I approached finding the letter writers. And I also told them with plenty of time for all the deadlines, because especially since many of their grants are due end of October, November 1st, it's really important to give them enough time to be able to write those.
Thank you, Amanda. And I also want to add that, yeah, your application deadline is your references application deadline as well, and you want to give them that time. And then this year, when you enter your references, that unlocks the step that allows you to enter your essays. And so you really want to enter your references so that you can move forward and enter your extracurriculars and your statement of interest there. And so it behooves everybody for you to go ahead and enter those references as soon as possible if you have them already. Allison, do you remember how you thought about selecting your letter writers?
Yeah, so my recommenders were my PhD advisor, one of my committee members, and then I volunteered at the Science Museum in my hometown, and so I had the volunteer coordinator be my third recommender. And so I tried to choose people that showed the breadth of what I had done throughout my academic career. So obviously my PhD advisor was the obvious first choice, since I worked the closest with her. And so for her, you know, she knew I was interested in this program, and that was no issue. For my committee member and for my for the supervisor at the museum, I just carved out some time to sit down with them and talk one-on-one about why I was interested in the program, what I was hoping to do with it. And they used that to write their letters. So I think it's really helpful to talk with whoever you'd like to write you a letter about why you really want to do this fellowship, so they have something to kind of work with.
To add to that, I didn't sit down with them, but I do remember I did share with them my personal statements, so then they could use that also for a better understanding of why I wanted to do it.
And Vince, you applied to 2 different program areas. Did you use different letters, or do you remember what that letter process was like?
Yeah, so the letters were all the same for me. At first, I had asked 3 academic advisors to write them, and then I realized that's not who I am. Like, I'm not just an academic, right? So I ended up having my postdoc supervisor write me a letter of recommendation, and then the other two were people from outside of my scientific life that could speak, that could support what I was trying to say in my personal statement. So there are actually two gentlemen that I sang with, and one of them ended up being a professor in the School of Public Policy at UC San Diego. And it was one night we had a conversation about, like, why don't people listen to their doctors? Or like, why don't people listen to scientists? And this sort of turned into this kind of discussion about scientific education. I thought, you should write me a letter of recommendation. And the other one was an environmental lawyer, and so I thought, like, like Allison and Amanda said, like, these are letters of support. They're not really to say, like, yeah, they did the things that are on your CV, but rather kind of help you tell the story of who you are based on the things that you have done and what you're going to do. So I agree, they should represent who you are as a person, not just, yes, he has 20 papers, or yeah, he presented at this conference or whatever. That's not what this fellowship is about. So that's not what your letter should reflect.
Thank you, Vince. I see everybody nodding along. So I think that really speaks to that idea of knowing your authentic self, knowing that collectively in your application, who it is that you're putting forward, what is the story you're telling about yourself, and these letters help tell that story. And so they can all talk about different facets of who you are and your experiences. So our next question from our audience is going to maybe jump us forward a bit, so past the application process to the interview process. And so there are two different types of interviews that can happen with the executive branch. There is virtual interviews that happen, and then finalist week in person here in Washington, D.C. So maybe thinking first about the virtual interviews that happen, what was that like for you? And let's see, I'm just going to leave it at that. And Vince, can you kick us off with what was that virtual interview like?
Yeah, so AAAS said, make sure that you leave the last week of February open for interviews. And then, so I found a flight to Japan for $407. And so I said, I'm going to go to the first week of March. And then I got an email saying, congrats, your interview is March 5th. So my interview was actually in Japan at 5 a.m. In really dinky hotel Wi-Fi. But yeah, be prepared. Like the biggest thing about the interview is it's over so fast, and just talk to other people offline. We've got sort of a crowdsourced list of questions that usually come up in those types of interviews. So that's why getting in contact with other fellows is a good idea, to ask, like, what kind of questions they ask you. Are they typical, like, tell us about yourself, or some of, like, the harder gear grinding questions. So yeah, rely on the experience of fellows who've gone through it for sure.
And Allison, what was your experience like? And did you interview at a time where it was virtual as a first round?
Yeah. So, I mean, I was not in Japan, or I was in my university with a pretty strong Wi-Fi connection, so that wasn't an issue. But it is weird. Just to be honest, I did not enjoy that experience. It's weird to look at a screen and see a room full of people asking you questions, and just knowing that you're like a giant head on a screen somewhere, and you're nervous about the application anyway. But I mean, I was really prepared for that interview, and that really helped me kind of overcome those nerves. So an important part of that interview is that you, previous to that, will have written a policy briefing on one of a writing prompt that AAAS will send to you, and that you'll essentially read your briefing memo to this panel of people, and then they'll ask you some questions relevant to that memo, and then they'll ask you those sort of typical interview type questions that Vince was talking about. And for me, and to prepare for that, I had, instead of lab meetings, we like would talk about my policy briefing, and I would, I'd practice it in front of a lot of different people, but I'd also talk about it with a lot of different people so that I had thought about it in lots of different ways and gotten different perspectives on it. So by the time I got to the interview, I felt like I just knew everything there was to know about my memo. So that really helped me to overcome the like weirdness of that online interview.
Thank you, Allison. And you answered what was going to be my follow-up question, which is how did you feel prepared? Like, how did you go ahead? And so practice, practice, practice. Amanda, what was that experience like for you?
It was a little bit the same. So I did practice ahead of time, kind of just the way that you practice your PhD defense, right? Like you have to know it inside and out, like what your policy is, what your position is, and be able to answer all sorts of questions about it. It was a little bit strange having 13 people in this room and, being that big floating head. We were also told to make sure that we maintained eye contact with the group. So it's a little bit weird to be staring at a camera, but not be staring down. So my sister showed me this little trick that you can actually make like the window much smaller and put it up behind the camera. So it looks like you're making eye contact the whole time. So that was a little bit strange because I'm used to looking at the screen, not at the camera. But otherwise, just, being able to, again, I think it's good to know possible questions, but a lot of them were similar to what you might get in any standard type interview, behavioral-based questions as well. So you can find a lot of those types of questions online. But I think, again, to be your authentic self, don't answer what you think the panelists want to hear. Answer genuinely how you would react to a situation and what you would be comfortable with, because if they're asking, they could ask something like, what if you get an offer from an office that isn't necessarily your first choice? Would you still be willing to learn and work in an environment that you might not be as comfortable with? And so it's important to know what you're comfortable with and like what you want out of the fellowship, because if you're not authentic, telling other people what you want because you're not being authentic with yourself, then you won't have a positive experience. So I think this whole thing, the interview process, but also this whole application process really helped me figure out what it is that I want. And that's what will come through.
Thank you all for sharing that. I hear a lot of preparedness around the subject matter, your policy memo, the talking points, the types of questions you might get asked, but also being prepared with the technical aspects of this might be an awkward experience, but there is a way to prepare. You all, that prepared you so well for this live chat. And to bring your authentic self to that experience as well, because honestly, you're being invited to that interview, it's because you belong there. And so kind of taking that off of you, you belong there, this panel really wants to hear from you, and coming in from that perspective might help as well as you prepare. So let's see, a related question is, so you've done a virtual interview, let's say it goes stellar, and you become a finalist, and you're invited to interview week for executive branch placements. Does anyone remember when it was that you first got access to the positions that you'd be able to interview for, and then how you picked which offices you would interview with?
So we didn't get the list until like late on a Friday night, and we weren't able to email anyone to set up new interviews until the Monday afternoon. And the list was very extensive, and I remember just being completely overwhelmed by it. So I actually started by just looking at the interviews where offices had already asked to meet with me and made sure I knew all of those since they were already scheduled, so that was convenient. But I did reach out to a couple other offices after really thinking about, what is worth taking my time. So for the interview week, you actually get to go to all the different offices. It's kind of like a treasure map all over DC, like trying to find where all these people are. So I just made sure to only email offices to add additional interviews for placements that I thought would be really a good match for me. And I actually ended up in an office that I applied, that I asked them for the interview. So that clearly worked well.
So it's good to know that it's you'll get access to the list, you'll be invited to some interviews, and it's fair in that everybody might have that same time frame in terms of when you have access and when you're allowed to start reaching out for interviews. Vince, what was that experience like for you?
Yeah, so we got it late Friday and we were flying out Sunday morning. I was flying out Sunday morning. So I had quite a few as well, and it is pretty intense. And then there's offices that, like, for example, I had 3 interviews at the NIH National Institute of Dental and Craniofacial Health, and I have teeth, and that's about as close as I can get to that office. And I thought, okay, this is going to be really interesting. And so actually, like, during the interview, I asked, like, if I can start the interview by asking, why did you want to interview me? It's a little bit of a risky thing, but then I thought, like, okay, I'm going to go through all of them and see what I think that they saw in my application, and so that would guide my conversation. But for the most part, like, yeah, I mean, it's really overwhelming. It's kind of fun, but you're stressed because you're always going to be late, no matter how hard you try. And then if you've never been to DC before, like I have, you don't know what the metro is, and then people yell at you because you're standing on the left of the escalator. But it's fun. Wouldn't do it again, but it was fun for sure.
Allison, I saw you nodding about the escalator.
Yeah, man, do not stand on the left side of the escalator. People will shove you out of the way. No, I mean, I think Amanda and Vince kind of hit on it. It's really, really fun. It's stressful. You're darting all over the city, but by the end of that week, you're a pro at interviews. I mean, you start just having answers roll off your tongue toward the end of it. I would also say, just to add on, that some people you do have some pre-assigned interviews when you come in, and some people will have like 17 interviews pre-lined up, and then some people will have none, and that doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter, because you have the opportunity to reach out to offices and find what your interests are and interview there. And so I would say not to be discouraged or influenced by how many interviews other people have, because that is a point of conversation when you are interviewing here.
Thank you all. I really hear, a lot of great tips and resources, and, there are things you can do to prepare for the virtual interview. There are things you can do to prepare for interview week. But the first step is going ahead and finishing up that application. It's hitting submit. It's using the network of fellows and alumni to kind of support you through that process. And so in our parting minutes, I would love to hear from the panel, what is the last thing you think somebody should do before they hit submit on their application? Allison, do you have anything that comes to mind?
Yeah, have as many people read it as possible. I had my parents read my applications, my friends outside of science, my advisor, my lab mates. I mean, the more eyeballs on those essays, the better it's going to be, and the more the narrative will come out to really make it a competitive application.
How about a tip from you, Amanda?
I 100% agree, as many eyes as possible. If you have the opportunity to finish your statement a little bit early and let it sit, so you can come back and read it one more time with fresh eyes, I think that's really helpful, just so you can make sure that you've covered everything that you want to cover, and definitely make sure that you or someone else, because you've had so many people look at it, proofread. Proofread.
And Vince, a parting recommendation before people hit submit on their applications?
Don't be scared. Just do it. Like, it's not going to matter, really. Like, if you think that you've done it well enough, and you've gotten, I had like 50 people read mine, and like strangers too. I said, oh, that's nice to meet you. Can you do me a favor and read this one pager? And then once you do it, just take a breath and then submit it. Like, it is what it is. If you don't get in now, you get in next year. And if you still love it and you don't get in, keep applying. Like, it's totally worth the stress.
Thank you for that excellent advice, everybody. Thank you to everybody who's on the chat. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your questions. I know we had many of them. We'll try to answer more. Please do write to us at the fellowship's email address that's in the chat box. The application is open through 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time on November 1st. We hope to see your application this year. Thank you to Allison, Amanda, and Vince for joining us today and sharing your fellowship experiences. Hope everybody has a great afternoon. Thank you all. Bye.